In this video, I want to talk about the structure of story. And to begin this, I'm actually going to start with a puzzle, what I call the human enigma. Humans are strange. We're young, incredibly young. Here we see a timeline that is spiraled down all the way back to the beginning. And we see here, all the way at the bottom, are the oldest creatures, single cells, really around 3 billion years ago. Moving on up, we get nucleated cells about 2 billion years ago. And we don't really start getting anything interesting until about 500 million years ago, when we start seeing things like trilobites. We get here into the Jurassic, Triassic, Permian period. That's, of course, the exciting period for all children who love dinosaurs. And then we have the Great Extinction Event, and then we come over here, and it's really not in the Cenozoic era that we start seeing organisms that we're really familiar with. For instance, horses. Horses, 5 million years old. Mastodons, 1.8 million years ago. And where are humans in all of this? Well, here we are. Just a tiny little blip right at the edge of this. Estimates of exactly how old humans are vary a little bit, somewhere between 200,000, maybe 500,000 years at the most. We are incredibly young as a species. And yet, we are everywhere. So, here we see a satellite picture of the dark side of the Earth, and all of these lights that you see are human settlements that are pretty large, and you see that we are on every single continent. Here, of course, is the United States, Europe, India, Japan, but every single continent has people on it, and enough people that we can light up the night sky. And if you think about, even these dark areas aren't devoid of humans. It just doesn't have enough humans to generate enough light to be seen from space. We also have people, of course, living on the oceans themselves, and, well, even in satellites circling the Earth, and in submarines underneath the sea. And so we are literally everywhere on this planet. But we didn't evolve for that. Our ancestors evolved for the savannas of Africa, something that looks a bit like this. And yet, we live everywhere. We live in the Arctic, we live in the tropics and jungle areas, we live in the mountains, we live on the water, all sorts of environments and biomes that we weren't evolved for. And so we've had remarkable adaptive radiation to just about every ecosystem imaginable. In an even shorter time, really only about 10,000 years, we went from small hunter-gatherer societies depicted in these slides here, and these were generally around 100 to 120 people, which turns out is about the maximum number of social interactions we can keep track of. And these small societies work well because everybody knows everybody else and everybody's keeping an eye on everybody else. And so nobody can really cheat because everybody's going to see what they do. That fosters cooperation, and it worked for us for most of our evolutionary history. And yet, with the advent of agriculture, we could feed much bigger societies. And what we see is now people living in huge metropolises like this, where we don't know anybody, really. We may have a few friends here and there, but we don't know everybody that we pass on the street. We don't know our neighbors' names. And this requires intricate forms of cooperation between people who are completely unknown to one another. I don't think this has ever really been clearer than in sort of the shortages we saw during the COVID-19 crisis. In those early days, we ran short on everything, and it was really clear how delicate these supply lines really are and how many people we rely on, people that we don't even know. So how can we account for this? How have humans radiated across the entire globe and even orbited the planet? Well, a lot of times people will say it's because we're smart. And, notwithstanding some of the stupid things that we do, humans are incredibly intelligent. But I'm going to argue that intelligence by itself isn't the answer. And to help you understand why it can't be the answer, I want to do a little thought experiment. Everyone here watching this video is pretty intelligent, probably among the best of the best. And yet, if I took a collection of you and dropped you off in this environment and said, okay, 6 months from now, I'll come and check on the civilization that you've created for yourselves, what do you think I would find? My guess is if I found anything at all, it would be a bunch of bones. Why? Is it because you're not smart? Of course not. You're intelligent. It's not your intelligence that's the problem. It's the access that you have to information that would allow you to live in this difficult environment. And people do live in this kind of environment. They thrive here. People live their entire lives in the deserts, and they live rich, fulfilling lives, feeding themselves, growing up, writing poetry, and having art forms and music and all of that. And so what is it that they have that you don't have? Is it because they're smarter than you? No, of course not. They have information that you don't have, adaptive information that allows them to survive in an environment that's unfamiliar to you. So we need something more than intelligence itself. What we need is culture. Now, culture is one of those words we all use, but we don't often reflect on. And in point of fact, there are probably as many different definitions of culture as there are people studying it. I think what most of us think when we think culture is we think the sum total of a set of shared beliefs, values, and practices. And so we kind of think about that as our traditions, our music, our art forms, our dance, the foods that we eat, that sort of thing. And that is culture. But there's another more interesting way of looking at culture as well. And that is that culture is the non-genetic, non-epigenetic, socially transmitted information. And so when thought about that way, culture becomes a kind of inheritance system, a way of getting information from one generation to the next, in particular adaptive information. So most of you are probably most familiar with the genetic inheritance system because you've spent a lot of time studying that as part of your undergraduate program. And so we think of information stored in DNA that gets obviously transcribed into RNA, translated into proteins, and this basic genetic program covers all of the things that our bodies need in order to make it from conception all the way to adulthood. And that's a remarkable system, but it's not the only inheritance system that we have. In fact, most of the information that we need in order to function adaptively in our world does not actually come from genes alone. Rather, it comes from our culture. And so genes are not unique. There are other inheritance systems that we can think of as well that are incredibly important for human development and adaptive radiation. One we just talked about, of course, is the genetic system. And you can't really have genetics unless you talk about epigenetics. So how are certain genes turned on and off? That becomes a really important system as well. And you can think of it as being a separate system in many ways from the genetic system, even though it relies on it. But there's also a lot of behavioral information that we can get and we can learn. And we're not alone. Other species do that as well. And so offspring learn from parents how to engage in adaptive behaviors. And then, of course, we have a symbolic system on top of that. We're using that right now to communicate through language, through speech, through writing, through other kinds of symbols. And it's really these last two that we think of as being part of the cultural inheritance system. And so culture really is a combination of behavior and symbolic inheritance systems on top of one another. So many of you at this point may be going, well, why in the world should I care about any of this? What does this have to do with story? Well, there are two reasons, I think, why this is so important for story. One is that we have an evolved psychology. Our brains have evolved in order to take in information in certain ways. Communication becomes a lot easier when you use a method that is compatible with how our minds work. Story is one of those methods. Second, stories, because they've been around with us ever since we started gathering around campfires to share information with one another, stories themselves have a deep structure that has evolved with us over time. And because culture represents cumulative adaptation, we can identify common structural elements that make for a good story. And if we understand common elements to good storytelling, then we can tell better stories and communicate better with our friends, family, and of course, the people we interact with professionally. So, what is this structure? Well, John Franklin has a fantastic book called Writing for Story. It's a bit dated at this point, but he was a Pulitzer Prize winner twice. And so I think listening to what he has to say is probably worth our while. And according to him, a story consists of a sequence of actions that occur when a sympathetic character encounters a complicating situation that he confronts and solves. So breaking this down, according to John Franklin, story begins with a sympathetic character who encounters a complication, and then the story proceeds until the story's resolution, in which that complication is resolved. And what unites all three of these things, of course, is action. Stories are not passive. They always involve a main character doing things in order to reach resolution. Now, John Franklin isn't the only one who has broken down story structure. Another one that you'll frequently come across is Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. This is a little bit more involved, and I think really applies to longer stories, certainly longer than what we typically deal with in these classes, but it really is kind of the same thing. In this case, you have your hero, the main character, who's living in the hero's normal world, and then something gets disrupted. There's a call to adventure, there's a meeting of a mentor, and then the hero goes into the unknown, this whole world where they learn and fail and learn new skills and meet some sort of tragedy, and then are kind of almost reborn from that. They're able to finally have that final challenge that leads to atonement. They get some kind of gift that they're able to bring back to the normal world. But if you really look at the hero's journey, it still involves your sympathetic character engaging in a complication. That complication calls that, in this case, a hero or our character, to some sort of action. And that action continues until you reach resolution. And so a lot of different ways of breaking stories down and labeling the different parts, but it really always boils down to what John Franklin had to say about complication, action, resolution. I think what the hero's journey really adds to the whole structure is that the character is changed. And I think that's a really important part of the story that we remember, the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that we pass on to future generations are those in which the character is fundamentally changed as a result of undergoing this encounter, this story, this complication, and the action towards resolution. And so there you have it. Really, all stories fall into this structure. And if you understand this structure, you're going to be better readers of stories, and of course, you'll be able to tell better stories and communicate your own experiences to others. And so this structure always comes down to a sympathetic character who encounters some kind of complication, which forces a series of actions that continue until the complication is resolved in a way that changes the character. So always keep this in mind, both when you're reading stories and when you're trying to tell your own stories.